Welcome back to the Risk on Investor channel. For those of you who are new here, my name is Chaz, and this channel is documenting my journey to putting a £1 million investment portfolio. So one of the key reasons why I'm doing that, building a portfolio, is so that I can have a comfortable retirement. And that obviously begs the question is how much do you actually need to be planning for? How much money do you need in your retirement accounts? When will you be able to retire? And all the kind of questions that entails. Now, most of them are how long is a piece of string type question, but I want to put a bit more flesh on the bones here in this video, outlining some of how I plan for it. And hopefully then you'll find that useful. I'll share some of the useful resources that I have. There's some spreadsheets that I've built in the past and some new ones I'm going to release with this video that I'll also just show you how to take advantage of and best use. Now, because my usual style of video is sort of a talking head type video, I actually thought this would be better done as a presentation. So there's a lot more graphs and data and things that I want to walk through and demonstrate. And so I'd love some feedback as well on this format. Is it helpful for these more informational type videos? Hopefully it is. But I would just say it's going to be quite a bit longer than my usual video just because it's packed with a lot more depth and content than you'd usually find in a YouTube video. Now, I would say again, if you're looking for the 5-minute entertainment dopamine hit on YouTube, then this probably isn't the video for you. But if you are looking to get into the nitty gritty of a bit more about planning for your retirement, how much money you might need in your pension, then this is probably more up your street and a bit more helpful for you. Now, before we get started, I will just say a quick disclaimer that I'm not a financial professional. I've got no financial professional training in my background. I am a civil engineer, so I've got some numbers-based background, but obviously that's very different to a finance background. So if there is any kind of real big important life decisions that you just don't know enough about, then I'd really encourage you to find a financial professional, someone that you can speak to and might be able to answer those questions a lot more tailored to your situation than you would otherwise be able to find on just a video online here from a random person. So there's a selection of different topics that I want to cover in this video. You'll see down the left-hand side of this presentation, I've kind of listed them out. And as we go through, I'll just highlight which one we're talking about at any one time. So that means you can skip around on the video if you want to, if there's specific sections that you want to look at first or revisit later on. I'll leave timestamps as well in the description below, and hopefully that will be really helpful for you. So why do we even need to think about pensions? For most people, retirement isn't really something you think about day to day, but it's probably something that you really need to give a lot of thought to once or twice in your life, just to make sure that first you set yourself up on the right track, and then that you probably are on the right track at some point later in your life. So I've got some data here from the Office of National Statistics. So they do a wealth and assets survey. So the latest results were published in June of 2022. So it's a little bit out of date, but it gives a good picture, and it's the most recent issue of the survey. So hopefully it's a good enough picture for these purposes. So there were just a couple of key points that I wanted to pick up on, which are slightly alarming, but hopefully will potentially resonate with you and the people that you know. So around 1 in 3 people don't expect to have any pension provision in the UK beyond the state pension. And 39% of self-employed people said they couldn't afford to contribute to a pension. So again, they're just going to be relying on a state pension. So these two charts also give a bit more of an idea about pension saving in the UK. So you'll see that only just over half of actively working adults in the UK are contributing to a pension. The dark blue bar at the bottom, which is rising, is due to auto-enrollment really. So that's a defined contribution pension. And again, we'll touch on a little bit more of that later in this video. But I think that's quite encouraging that at least pension saving is starting to tick up. And I think some of the auto-enrollment is starting to take effect. Now, the two kind of bar charts on the right there is looking at pension values. So you can see that self-employed people have very little in pension savings, whereas employed people are more likely to have more significant pension savings. And actually, when you get to that 55 to state pension age category on that employed bar chart, you'll see that the average person is approaching £100,000 in assets. So it's not too bad generally. So what does that £100,000 pot, if you're the median employed person who's approaching retirement, you've got £100,000, what does that actually get you? Now, there's a few different ways of looking at this. So there were pension freedom laws that came into effect. And so you can effectively withdraw your money out of your pension in a much wider variety of ways than you used to be able to. So the primary way that you used to be able to extract money from your pension is you would build up this pot, and then when you would retire, you'd take that pot and you'd buy an insurance product known as an annuity. Now, an annuity is just a way of taking that pot and getting a regular income. And so that's a product that usually lives and dies with you as an individual. Now, annuities are still an option. You don't have to not buy an annuity, but with the new pension freedoms laws that came into effect, there's a wider variety of ways that you can draw on the money in your pension. But I'm going to use the annuities here as a good sort of benchmark starting point, because I think it's quite an easy way to start getting some rough numbers together. So you can see the chart here that we've got on the screen, and this is the latest annuity rates as of broadly the week that I'm recording these, and these were taken from the Hargreaves Lansdown website. And so you can see that if you wanted an annuity that finished when you died and was inflation linked from the age of 65, so let's say 65 is the age that you've decided you're going to retire, you've been building up your pension pot, you get to 65, well, here's the amount of money that you could potentially get per year for every £100,000 that you have saved. And now that broadly aligns, as we looked at in the last slide, with the average kind of pension pot being around that £100,000 number. So you'll see that at 65, if you want an income that will go up every year with inflation, so you can see there in the highlighted box, I've got single life, which means it's tied to you. So when you die, payments stop. The RPI is the retail price index. So you'll see that that one there that I've highlighted will increase yearly with the retail price index. And so if you were to buy that with your £100,000 pot, you get £4,421 per year. So that's around £368 a month for your £100,000 pension pot. Now, that doesn't sound like much for a lifetime of saving, does it? But just also consider that this is based on the median pension pot of that £100,000 figure. So 50% of people retiring will have less than that, would be able to buy an annuity with even less than that. And you can see that if you wanted to retire a little bit earlier, say age 60 or 55, the actual amount of money you get in an annuity is even less. Whereas if you're retiring later in life, then your annuity will be higher. And that's all linked to your life expectancy. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. Hopefully that didn't sound too doomy and gloomy to start with. There's plenty that you can do about this. And that's really what this video is about, and what the sort of retirement planning whole area is about. Because 368 quid a month isn't that much to live on. So the Office for National Statistics actually has a calculator where you can plug in your current age and your sex, and it will tell you roughly how long you might live. So I plugged in my age and my gender here. So I'm a 28-year-old male, and it tells me that my life expectancy is about 85 years. So if we looked back at that annuity table, if I was purchasing an annuity at the age of 65, that annuity will pay out for me for around 20 years on average, and it will increase every year with inflation, so it should maintain its purchasing power. Now you'll see that this actually also gives me about a 10% chance that I'll get to 99. So that means I would potentially have to fund a retirement 10% of the time for 35 years, which is a significant length of retirement, especially as I started work after university. So I was around 21, 22 years old. If I worked to the age of 65, my retirement is getting on to the same length as my entire working career was. Now, if you want to play around with this calculator and see what your kind of life expectancy chances are, then I'll leave links to it in the description below. I'm going to gather up a selection of resources, which I'll post in the description or the comments below this video, and it will have links to websites, spreadsheets, all the kind of useful things that I mentioned in this video. Now, there's loads of different savings vehicles you can use for a pension. I'm really going to concentrate on the two main vehicles, and I'm going to only touch on them briefly here because I don't want to teach you to suck eggs if you've already done a bit of research into this. But there are a few different things that I think it's worth highlighting. So you'll see I've put the two vehicles, which is the individual savings account and the pension wrapper, as two separate columns, and just done a bit of comparing and contrasting. Now, each of these vehicles, there's loads of different varieties within the kind of category itself. So for example, with an ISA, you could have a stocks and shares ISA, you can have a cash ISA, a lifetime ISA, innovative finance ISA. I mean, there's an ISA for every day of the week, it feels like. And it's a similar situation with pensions. So most people will have a workplace pension if you're employed and you qualify for the auto-enrollment scheme. Unless you've opted out, you may have a self-invested personal pension, otherwise known as a SIP. There's a lot more flexibility that you can do with a SIP. So, for example, you can buy commercial property within a SIP. You can take loans against a SIP. there's quite a lot more that you can do with it. But for the purposes of this video and for the kind of planning, I'm going to almost look at the stocks and shares ISA as the ISA product, and I'm going to look at just sort of a bog standard SIP that we might be more familiar with as the everyday person. So if I just went and opened a SIP with Freetrade or Vanguard or something like that on one of those platforms, they would just give you a tax wrapper where you can invest in a selection of funds. They don't offer a lot more of these more complicated and interesting things that you can do with a SIP. So the first thing I just looked at is the tax relief on contributions. So with an ISA, you're taxed on the way in. So that means you're contributing to an ISA after you've already paid tax on some money. And so that's why I've given it across here. Whereas the pension, you can often do through a workplace pension, a salary sacrifice contribution. So that'll be before any tax is taken out, or vice versa. If it's an after-tax contribution, or if you're self-employed and making a contribution at another point during the year, you can claim some of that tax back, and that will go into your tax wrapper. And so you'll see there's a slight difference between the two. Now, capital gains and dividend tax growth is both completely free in both of them. So if you invest in something and it grows and you realize a gain, as long as it's within that tax wrapper, there's no tax to pay at the point that you realize that gain. Now you'll see as well that some of these I've put little stars next to. So for example, the easy access to the funds. So with an ISA, you can contribute and withdraw at any point, so long as you haven't exceeded your contribution limits for a year. And so that's why I've given that a big green tick there. Whereas the pension, you have to be of a pensionable age. So depending on how old you are, what pension accounts you hold, it could be anywhere from 57 to upwards of that at the moment. And the numbers do appear to be changing as time goes on. So it's one just to check with your pension provider. And again, we've got the tax-free withdrawal. Again, it's got a star next to it. And that will depend as much on your situation. So an ISA is generally tax-free. However, if you're looking at, say, a lifetime ISA product, there are withdrawal penalties if you're not using it for either a purchase of a first home or if you're over the age of 60. Now, with a pension, I've given it across for the tax-free withdrawals because you can take money out of your pension tax-free. So you could take a 25% lump sum when you reach an age when you can do that, or some of the income that you draw from your pension might be tax-free. But the income that you draw from a pension counts towards your income tax threshold. So everyone has a tax-free allowance, and when you exceed that, you'll start paying tax on that. So if you're drawing too much from your pension, or with your pension income combined with other incomes, if it's above that tax-free allowance, then there may be tax to pay on that. So that really depends on your individual circumstances. The maximum yearly contributions as well, I think for most people will just be irrelevant. If you can contribute £20,000 to an ISA, then you're in a very good position generally. And again, if you can contribute £60,000 to your workplace pension or SIP, then again, you're probably in a very comfortable position financially. The final one to possibly think about is inheritance benefits. So if we're thinking about retirement and planning that far ahead, it's probably worth just bearing in mind as well inheritance and who would inherit your assets after you pass away. So an ISA doesn't really have any inheritance tax benefits. It's just part of your estate and is taxed as such. Whereas pensions, depending on the age that you pass away and a few other rules, there's potentially times when your pensions can be outside of your estate for tax purposes at time of death. So that's something just to be aware of as well. And it is worth planning a little bit more about that if you're maybe approaching retirement or you're looking at how you can be more tax efficient for your beneficiaries and successors. Now, because these two saving vehicles have quite different benefits and drawbacks, as we've seen in that table below, we need to think about how we're going to best utilize them for our retirement savings. Now, this really mostly applies if you're looking for an early retirement, or I should say it's probably more important to look at if you're looking for an early retirement. And that's because within the pension wrapper, you're normally age restricted about when you can access that. So for many people, it's 57 upwards now. Some people have protected pensions at the age of 55. Again, check with your provider. So if you wanted to retire earlier than that, then you're going to need money that you can access that's outside a pension wrapper. And so this is where an ISA comes in. So one common route is for you to build up an ISA, which will cover you from whenever you plan to early retire until the age you can access your pension, and then you start drawing down on your pension. Alternatively, you can mix and match your ISA and pension. So you might withdraw money from your pension up to your tax-free allowance and then top up the money that you want from your ISA, which is tax-free. And so that might allow you to have a higher sort of effective take-home pay from your savings than you would otherwise have. Now, the ratios of this is just going to depend on your individual circumstances as well. It will depend on how much money that you plan and when you plan to retire as well. So again, it's probably worth seeking some professional advice there if you're either planning to retire particularly early or you're planning to have a fairly large income in your retirement, because there may be quite substantial tax savings that you could get from planning this out properly. Now, I just want to start touching on the state pension as well, because for most people, this will make up quite an important part of your retirement planning. Now, the state pension is a form of benefits that's paid to everyone over a certain age based on your qualifying national insurance contributions. And so just for clarity of terminology as well, when I'm referring to state pension, I'm referring to what the government calls the new state pension. And so that applies to people born after this, or it applies to men born after the 6th of April 1951, or women born after the 6th of April 1953. So you've probably noticed in your pay, if you're employed, that you'll get a deduction for national insurance contributions, and this actually fills up credits. And you can go online onto the government gateway and you can access your account and you can check how many years of state pension credits you're starting to build up. So you can see here on the right hand side, I've just taken a quick screen snip from my government gateway, and you can see that I've got 6 years of full contributions, and I've actually got a year in 2016, 2017 of some partial contributions where I did some summer internship type work. So once you reach 10 years of full years worth of qualifications, then you stand to benefit from the state pension. So I've got 6 out of the 10 years required, and once you get to 35 years, then you would qualify for the full state pension. So between 10 and 35 full years of qualifying, you effectively buy more state pension as you go. So the current full state pension, once you've got 35 years of qualifying income, is about £961.62. And I'll leave links to resources again where you can check your state pension eligibility in the just list of general resources that go along with this video. Now, there is a couple of things you should be aware of with the state pension. So the first is that the state pension age has been creeping up over the last few decades. So women's state pension ages have been brought into line with men's, and they're planned to slowly increase up to 68. So what I've done here is I've taken a few snips from the government website just with some date of birth and when you'll reach your state pension age. Again, I'll leave a link to this page in the resources so that if you're maybe outside of that range of dates, then you can just check a little bit how you might qualify and when you might qualify. But I would say there's been some content bandied around about whether the pension age should go up even further. So it's currently planned to go up to 68. And there have been a few people who've started to say maybe 71 is a better place to go. And I've done a video on that in the past, which again, I'll link to, that you can go back and have a look at. Now, the primary argument for the state pension increasing is that lifespans have outstripped the pension age change. So life expectancy has dramatically increased over the last 50 or 60 years, but the state pension age hasn't really increased with it. So that means as a nation, we have much longer to fund in terms of pension provisions to those who have reached state pension age than we would have had to have done 50 years ago. So some people will plan for their state pension in different ways, which again, I'll touch on in a little bit. So the reason that this trend is maybe a little bit concerning for some people is that it starts to be floated around, and it's not really seriously being talked about in political circles, but some people are starting to get a little bit worried about it, maybe in more financial type circles. And that's that the state pension could be significantly changed from its format today. So currently, as long as you have the qualifying years, you can claim the state pension. But what if it's removed, for example? Now, the evidence that there might be some kind of trimming of the state pension or changes to the state pension is probably in the government-introduced auto-enrolment. So if you're classified as a worker between the ages of 22 and state pension age and earn at least £10,000 per year and work in the UK, then your employer should automatically opt you into a pension saving. Now, currently your employer must then pay a minimum of 3% of your qualifying salary into the pension, and you should pay 5% in for an 8% total. Now, individual employers may increase that. So, for example, the first employer I worked with when I left university would pension match up to 7%. So that meant they would pay in the basic 3%, but if I put in 7%, they would up their contribution to 7% as well, which would give a 14% total. Now, different employers have different requirements. The next employer that I worked was slightly less generous. And again, I think it varies quite a lot by sector, but it's just worth paying a little bit of attention to. Now, I personally don't see the state pension being abolished anytime soon, but I do plan as if it isn't there just in case. Then if it's there, that would be a great welcome bonus. But if we run some basic numbers based on someone who's in median earnings with the minimum pension contribution starting at age 22, then by 65 you could have built up a private pension of around £305,000, and that's obviously significantly better than the current £100,000 average pot. So I think from that point of view that the auto-enrollment pensions are going to have a really significant benefit for people's general pension savings going forward. And if we looked back at the annuity tables, we'd see that that £305,000 would get you around £13,500 per year in income. So just over £1,100 a month, a little less after income tax is paid as well. And another thing maybe to bear in mind with the state pension that some people are talking about is that it could become means tested in the future. So there could be a situation where, because everyone is auto-enrolled in a pension, that the government requires you to draw down on that pension first, and then you would qualify for a state pension after you've already depleted your private savings. But again, that's not seriously being talked about in political circles. So whether it will happen or not, who knows? And choose to plan however you'd like. Now, we know the basics of retirement planning, so let's start looking at some of the numbers here. So I've got a little video playing here in the background, which just looks at a budgeting spreadsheet that you can have access to. Again, I'll put the link in the resources tab below, so you can put in how much money that you bring in per month, any kind of debts you have, lay out all your spending here. And then eventually you'll get to a point where it will demonstrate across the bottom there. You can see a few different tabs. And so once you've filled in all your spending, it will give you a breakdown of your income versus your outgoings and percentages where your outgoings are going. So for example, here we'll see that if I hop across to the dashboard, you'll see that when I filled in some basic numbers there, there's actually greater spending than the money that's coming in. So I'll go back and edit it. Now, I think this is a great place to start when you're thinking about retirement savings. So you need to have a good handle on what you're currently spending. And that's because as we get to retirement, your spending is going to shift, but we need to know where it's going to shift from as a baseline. Now, this isn't just helpful for planning your retirement. I think it's helpful just full stop in your personal finance journey, because it will really help you spot if maybe there's some subscriptions in your bank statements that you haven't spotted that you don't use anymore and that you can cut out. And so maybe that can help free up some money for you. So just sitting down with your bank statements and going through this budgeting spreadsheet, I think could be really helpful. You don't have to use this spreadsheet. It's just a really basic spreadsheet that I've put together just because I know some people prefer to have that kind of template that they fill in and the kind of visual scenarios. But you can grab that down again in the resources below. Just be aware that if there are annual spending commitments, it's worth trying to cut those down to monthly spending commitments. So, for example, if you're spending £400 on your car insurance a year, maybe put in about 35 quid a month to cover that, and then you'd expect some kind of free float in your money each month, because that would then mean that you can cover that car insurance over the long term. So once you've done your budgeting exercise, then we start needing to look at how much money you might need when you come to retirement. So some of the big expenses you might have spotted in your current budget once you've done that might be things like your mortgage, and those are potentially going to change as you get older. So again, other than your mortgage, maybe you'll only need one car if you're a couple and you both drive to work, but you need separate cars for that. Or you might not have dependents in terms of children who are as reliant on you. Maybe they're older by this point. They might have bought their own house already, or might have settled into a routine, which means they can support themselves. So that might also reduce the spending requirements that you need when you come to retirement. So there's a company called Fidelity, which is one of the largest asset managers on the planet. And this kind of chart here that you can see on the screen comes from their website. And they generally estimate that people need between 55 and 85% of their pre-retirement income. So generally, the lower your income is to start with, the higher the percentage would be, because more of your income is likely to be going on essential things rather than wants and pleasures and things like that. So now that you've got your budget, it's worth looking at what you think won't be in your budget by the time you retire. So, for example, will your mortgage run out before you are looking to retire? Because that will be a big chunk of money that you won't need every month. And so this is, again, look at your budget now. It might be worth highlighting certain sections that you expect to disappear. Maybe you've got some outstanding loans that you're paying down at the moment, or maybe you don't see yourself having so many subscriptions when you're older. Now's the chance to really kind of think about what you want. And so whilst there might be some reductions as well, there might also be some increases. So maybe in your early years of your retirement, you'd love to go on a few big holidays. And so you're going to need more money coming in at the beginning of your retirement to cover the cost of those holidays. Now, again, before we get into the nitty gritty of actually modeling anything out, don't worry, I've got some spreadsheets to help you with that as well, so you don't have to do all the maths yourself. It's worth just going over the mechanics of the pensions themselves as well, because so many people that I've spoken to, friends, family, just haven't even looked at their pension. They don't know where their money goes. They just see that it goes out of their payslip every month. And so this is really worth doing just as a really basic exercise if you've never done it before. So find out who your pension is with. You may have multiple pensions, in which case it may be worth looking to combine them into one pension pot. Most of the pension providers have just a simple form you can fill out where you say that you want to transfer it all from X place to another place, and they'll help you out with that situation. So then you just have one big pot that you can look after rather than trying to track down a pot from every employer that you've got. So here on the screen, I've got some screenshots of a really typical type of pension. So this is actually from one of my workplace pensions. And so the top chart there shows how the pension is invested in terms of its changing allocation over time. So this type of pension product is really common for people to be put into in a workplace pension. It's often called a life strategy or a target date retirement fund or a lifestyle fund. And the general premise of these funds is that they take a little bit more risk the further you are away from retirement. And as you approach retirement, they change the ratios that you're invested in. So you can see here on this chart that we've got the growth fund at the beginning, which makes up the majority of your investments the further away you are from retirement. And as you get close to retirement, it starts to step those down and it moves them into lower and lower risk funds until you hit retirement. And the idea is that then that will help you withstand any big hits in the stock market, because the growth type funds will be more susceptible to drops in value. And so it should mean that if you retired on the verge of the 2008 financial crisis, that your pension pot wouldn't be cut in half that year, that it might only be cut down 25% or something like that, for example. I've also just screenshotted some of the actual holdings from within some of the funds. And so you'll see that the funds generally have a UK bias if you're based in the UK. I'm not really sure why, but they do tend to do that. And you may be aware that the UK has significantly underperformed over the last 20-25 years. So especially if you're later in your retirement planning stage, so maybe you're later in your working career, there's a good chance that your pension may have underperformed what it could have done because of that. But this is obviously the great time now to be looking at that and thinking about that, and possibly even doing something about that if you do want to change strategy now. Now, there's only really two levers that you have to pull when you're thinking about your retirement planning. The first is your savings rate, and the second is your investment returns. Now, you can change one dial, you can change both dials, you can change no dials if you don't want to. But this is really the two variables that we have to look at. So I'm just going to look at them each quickly one by one, just so that you get an idea of what the difference is that it can make. So the first is the savings rate. So I just wanted to illustrate how small changes can make a big difference, especially when paired with time. So imagine here that you've got two people, you've got person A, person B. They both earn £2,500 per month. And let's say person A saves 10%. So they save and invest that 10% in their pension. So £250 per month. And person B decides they want 15%. So an extra £125 per month. So £375 per month they're investing into their pension. Now, those figures sort of seem slightly reasonable, maybe on the slightly upper end. So when you consider that the auto-enrollment pension would be 8%, most people will generally be there or thereabouts at what person A is, where I've just ballparked at 10%. But if people are willing to just crank it up a little bit to a higher percentage, then people might end up closer to person B, who's putting in 15%. Now, you can see that if they both invested over 40 years and earned the same return, then person A would have invested £120,000 over their lifetime, whereas person B would have invested £180,000 over the same time frame. But person B has come out a whopping £725,000 better off than person A, just because of that little bit of extra contribution over a long time period. Now, these figures are really just for illustration purposes only, but it helps underline that power of time and small changes in attitude for your investment returns. So depending on where you sit with your retirement planning, and you'll see where that comes out further on when you actually start crunching the numbers, it may be beneficial, especially if you're on the younger age of the spectrum, to really think about what would an extra £100 a month do, or what would an extra £50 a month do for my savings. Now, for some people, cutting back so they can put that extra money into savings isn't what they want. Some people would like to expand their income to make that extra money up. So I have actually started a playlist as well, where I've been trying some different sort of, I hate the phrase a little bit, but sort of side hustle businesses where you can get a little bit of extra money per month. So I've tested a couple out now. There's the first couple in the playlist have been successful, but I'm about to upload a third one which hasn't been so successful. So you could follow that and watch some of those, and it might give you some inspiration about how you could get that extra 5% a month that might just help turbocharge your investments and savings. And again, I'll leave links to that down in the description and the resources below. So the second lever that we have in growing a pension is the investment returns. Now, this is an entire video series in itself, so I'm only really going to touch on it in quite a high level. A really popular investing strategy is index investing. Now, there are absolutely thousands of passive indexes you can follow. Some will have tilts towards specific sectors, some will have factor tilts such as value or momentum, and some will just try and capture a really broad range of geographic regions. So one particular very popular index is the S&P 500. So this is an American index which seeks to track the performance of 500 of the largest companies that are based in the US. And it's had very strong performance recently. But I did just want to highlight just a few bits and pieces about indexes, because indexes do have their trade-offs, and you need to be aware of those because it will affect your investment decisions. So this table that I've got on the screen here shows broadly the last sort of 20 years of index returns, and it's comparing the S&P 500, which is in the kind of goldy yellow color, with the MSCI EAFE, which is a little bit of a mouthful, but is basically an index that tries to track the entire world, but it excludes the US, which the S&P 500 focuses on, and Canada. And so we can see here that in the early 2000s, the US markets actually underperformed the international markets on 7 out of the 10 years that we've got listed there. Whereas if we skip down to the 2010s, we'll see that it's pretty much been the reverse, with 8 out of 10 being the S&P 500 outperforming in a given year over the rest of the world. Now, do I know whether the S&P 500 will continue to outperform a lot of other passive indexes? I have no idea, and anyone who can tell you with certainty is lying to you, but it is just a trade-off that you need to be aware of, that certain indexes will perform better in the long run than others. And I've done a little video comparing the S&P 500 versus a global index, which again, I'll leave a link to down in the description below. As a sort of too long didn't read, the S&P 500 has generally delivered superior returns, but my personal preference is a global fund over an S&P 500 because it's got a lower volatility. Now, just to reinforce that point, here's a simulation starting in the early 1990s that looks at 3 major asset classes. So it's looking at equities, which we've got in the blue, it's looking at bonds, which we've got in the red, and it's looking at cash, which we've got in the kind of orangey yellow color. So if you ignored the chart at the bottom and you just looked at the amount of money that you started with and the amount of money that you finished with, then you would jump all in on the equities, forget about the cash and the bonds, because you'd see that you finished with a much larger number over this kind of 30-year time stretch. But when you look a little bit closer at the chart and a little bit more on the rest of the table above, then you might get a slightly different story. So about 15 years after the simulation starts, the bonds, which are in red, start outperforming the equities, which are in blue, for a short period of time. And that's the global financial crisis that you can see with that dip in the charts. And so that you'll see that the equities curve, which is the blue one, was a lot more up and down just to get to that same point, whereas the bonds curve was a lot smoother and a lot more predictable in terms of the returns. And so actually for that 15-year period, it wouldn't have mattered which one you would have picked, but you might have slept a lot better at night if you'd had a more heavily concentrated bond portfolio than an equity portfolio. Now we can see that cash has generally underperformed both, but cash is cash. You can't lose the cash in a way. You just get an interest rate on the cash, but it does lose purchasing power. And so generally a good portfolio will blend some different asset classes, preferably ones that have low correlations, because it might mean that, say, when equities drop, you might get, say, a commodity or utilities stocks often are inversely correlated, so they might often rise in times of turbulence. And so they're generally paired, and there are different funds that you can go out and buy that have pre-blended some of these for you. Again, some of these are just indexes that you can passively follow. Some are more actively managed funds, but again, the decision is up to you. But this is something that will significantly affect your long-term retirement outcomes, but is something that, whilst we have a choice in what we can invest in, we can't necessarily dictate what the returns are going to be long-term. So now we need to start thinking about your retirement goals. So by now you should have a grasp of the investment vehicles that are available to you, some of the levers and considerations that you can make when planning for your retirement. So it's time to start talking about specific numbers, because really this is where we start to find out whether you're on track, how you're doing, what you might need to do to change that to get back on track if you're not on track, or if you're overperforming. Do you want to have that excess money in retirement, or would it be better spent spending it now on things that you can enjoy now with your family and friends? So just as a good rule of thumb starting point that I like to use is I go back to those annuity tables and I work backwards. So let's assume that there is a state pension and it will exist. So that banks me best part of £12,000 straight away. Great, assuming I reach full 35 years of contributions. So next, let's say I want £25,000 in total income as an individual. So that means I have a shortfall of about £13,000 to fill. Now, using the single annuity RPI linked product, we can see that for each £100,000, we get that £4,421 at 65. So for £13,000 a year, we'll need about £295,000. Now, there are some big flaws in this approach, but it gives us a number to start thinking about. And you'll remember when we looked at the auto-enrollment option earlier in this presentation, that having a median salary for your entire career from 22 to 65, putting away that 8% would get you a pot of approximately that size needed for that £13,000. But what if the state pension didn't exist? What if you still wanted that £25,000? Well, now to get that same £25,000, you'd need to have a pot of around £570,000 to buy the same annuity. As you can see, that state pension assumptions can have a really big impact on your retirement savings. And so it's a significant risk that I think you really need to pay attention to and give considerable thought to. Now, again, as I said in the video before, I think personally that the state pension will still be around, but I'm planning that if it's not, because that's the worst case scenario, and then an extra £12,000 from the state pension will be a very welcome boost, and that might mean that I can support children or grandchildren financially in my retirement that I might not necessarily have had the resources to do otherwise. Now, why did I say it was a bad assumption, just sort of pick an annuity and work backwards? And it really boils down to health spans. So if you watched the video that I flagged you to earlier about the state pension potentially rising to 71 based on some proposals, then you'll know that I talked a lot about health spans. And that's generally that as we get older, we tend to do a lot less just because physically we aren't able to. And you can see from this chart here, it collects spending data for different categories, which are sort of named such as extravagant couples and frugal foodies and things like that. But what they all generally share in common is that once you start to reach the age of about 75, your spending starts to drop off. And that's just because you're less mobile, your health isn't going to be as good, you're probably going to go on fewer holidays, so your disposable income spending is probably going to go down. So as such, we don't necessarily just want that annuity product where we're going to have a single income every year for the rest of our lives that sticks to RPI inflation and keeps us with the same purchasing power. We're going to want to spend a lot more money at the beginning of our retirement, and it's probably going to taper off as we get older. Now, there's different ways to model this out. I've got two spreadsheets that can help you out. The first is just a really simple projection tool, which will help you determine if your current savings rate will help you reach your retirement date and target amount based on historical return data. So it's pre-filled in with S&P 500 data, but you can just put in your own returns data. If you wanted to use a different index, you'll just need to go and find the data for that specific index to put in. And there's only 5 or 6 variables you can plug in. It's a really simple chart, but it will just spit out a date when you'll hit the amount of money that you would expect to need. And that's based on just a percentage return. So we saw earlier from the annuity rates that RPI linked rate from 65 was around £4,400 per £100,000. So if you wanted to model that annuity rate, you could put in 4.4% because that's roughly what it is as your withdrawal percentage rate in this spreadsheet, and it will just spit you out some numbers that might just help you get a ballpark figure for where you're going, where you've started, and where you're going to end up. Now, the second spreadsheet is a lot more complex, and this is the one that I just want to do a little bit of a walkthrough for. And again, you can grab a copy of this spreadsheet, but it does more of a cash flow type modeling scenario. So you can put in your spending amounts and it will give you successes based on different simulated returns based on historic results. And that can just help you stress test your portfolio. You can put in sort of one-off spending. Maybe you want to help some kids out with a house deposit, or you want to help with some university costs, or maybe you want to downsize actually and collect some extra money that you've got in equity in your home. So this sheet can help you model all of that. So just because it's a little bit more complicated, I do want to jump in and just demonstrate it, and we'll walk through an example selection of data just so you can see how it works. So welcome into the more cash flowy type modeling spreadsheet. This is the more complicated of the two we were looking at. So as you can see, there's a lot more data that I can plug in here, and it spits out potentially some more useful type charts, but we'll just sort of work our way through them, just maybe with a quick sort of worked example, and just see where we spit out with some random numbers. Just a few things to draw your attention to: cells with the little kind of triangles in them have little tab notes so that you can get a bit more information if you need to. Again, just some things might not be clear otherwise. So let's take our imaginary person. Let's say they're 25 years old. Let's say they're targeting to retire at, maybe we'll just leave that as 60. Life expectancy, we're going to put in 95. So if you remember back in the example video, mine as a 28-year-old was 85 with a 1 in 10 chance of 99. So 95 seems sort of semi-reasonable to be plugging in here as a bit of a guesstimate. Let's say as this 25-year-old has been working for a little while, they've maybe already built up £10,000 into their pensions through workplace contributions and other methods, and let's say that they're putting in £300 a month. Again, this contribution start age links up with our current start age there, so that's fine. Stop contributing at age 60. The spreadsheet will just assume that this contribution will increase in line with inflation every year, so that's just something to bear in mind. It is a slight simplification there in the spreadsheet. So any additional regular income that we're expecting to come in, so I've plugged in here again the state pension age starting at 68, so someone who's 25 years old at the moment can expect 68 years old, and again it's ending at our life expectancy endpoint, and that's roughly the monthly income that you'll get from the state pension. Now I could put in some extra bits and pieces. Maybe the person worked in the NHS, or maybe they worked in the police or something like that and had a defined benefit pension in which they were expecting to get when they retire, so we could put that in. Let's maybe put in a rental income. Let's say this is bought sort of later in the career and the person will have this all the way up to death, and let's say that after taxes etc it brings in £300 a month. Now, one-off incomes we could see, so I've put in some common ones, so maybe an inheritance. If you have particularly wealthy family where you might get a sizable inheritance, that could be something you could plug in here. If you're young, you probably aren't going to plug anything in there because it's too far out to plan for that kind of thing, and I probably wouldn't rely on that kind of one-off gift anyway. But something that is potentially in your control would be a property downsize. So potentially maybe by the time you're reaching 70 years old, maybe you don't need such a big house anymore. And maybe, there's not £1 million, but let's say £100,000 in equity that you can release by downsizing your house. So that could be a sort of nice, big, chunky one-off amount of income we have coming in. This section here looks at the investments, so you can't actually edit this section here. So you'll see there's 3 portfolios that it looks at. So a global index fund, an S&P 500 passive index tracker, and a global 60/40 bond portfolio. So you can see here just where I've taken some of this data from. It generally looks at the last 25 years. And it is worth just saying that these returns are in pounds. So these are unhedged returns. So currency fluctuations do affect the returns quite a bit over longer time periods. So again, just something to be aware of. And again, past performance might not necessarily reflect what happens in the future. But over the last sort of 25 years, these have been the median monthly returns and our standard deviations. And from that, what this spreadsheet does is it plots a Gaussian distribution. So if you may remember from school, a sort of bell curve distribution, and it will then pull out random returns from that distribution going forwards. So we can plug in our platform fees and any fees for trackers that we might be following. So a typical platform fee might be sort of 0.15%, something in that ballpark. And again, maybe a 0.2 or something like that for the actual product that you're using with inside that platform. So I'm maybe just going to change this, bump it up just a touch to 0.35. Again, it's probably better to be a little bit conservative on those kind of things. If you're investing in something a little bit more sort of niche, then there might be higher fees for that particular product. So just be aware. The other thing to just be aware of that you won't be able to see in on this screen because it's cut off at the top is because this is a Google Sheets spreadsheet. There's a loading bar that you'll see in the top right hand corner. So every time you change something on here, it will take a little while just to propagate through. Because what this spreadsheet does is it does 200 simulations for each of these 3 portfolios. And so it's doing, every time you change a number, it simulates 600 portfolio outcomes, which will then get presented to you on the next tab when we get to it at the bottom here. So something that will have a long-term impact is the inflation expectations. So central banks tend to target 2%. I believe in the UK we've averaged somewhere between sort of 3 and 3.5%. So maybe if I bump that up to 3%, we'll see what that does to us a little bit later on. And then we can look at our general retirement expenditure. Now, this sheet I've been filling in as if it's like a single person. So you could fill this in assuming that it reflected 2 people. And so maybe, for example, £1,500 a month from 60 to 95 would be my general spending money every month for just my portion of the bills and requirements. But say I wanted a little bit more in there. Let's bump that up to £2,000 a month. And I've said that when I get to 85 years old, the monthly expenditure is going to reduce by 25%. Now I could put in some later life care costs if I wanted, or some other one-off costs. Again, you may have things that you know are going to come up. Maybe from 90 to 95, you could put in some care home costs if that's what you wanted to do. Again, I'm just going to leave that blank for now. Now, other one-off retirement costs that might be worth putting in. So possibly your mortgage might not be paid off, especially if you're looking to retire slightly on the younger side. So I'm going to say for now that at 60 years old, I'm hoping my mortgage is paid off. In reality, mine is due to finish significantly before I'm age 60, so that's good. Now, it could be that I'm also looking for housing assistance. Again, when I'm reaching that age, if I'm maybe sort of 60, I might have a child who's looking towards potentially buying a house and they might need a bit of house deposit help from the bank of mum and dad, or maybe I want to fund them through some university fees. Again, I could start plugging that in down here. And we'll see what that's done is that's built us up a little profile of what our lifetime income and expenditure is. So we see here in our red, we've got the total contributions. So there's a little step up here and there's contributions going in which relate to our £300 a month here. And we can see that when we get to the age of 50, we have a little bump up here in our rental income, and that finishes as we retire. And then we've got another big bump here as state pension kicks in, and we've got a big spike here as we get our property downsizing coming. The blue here is our expenditure. So we can see here there's a big discrepancy here at the start of our retirement where we're spending a lot of money, but we're not actually getting that much extra money coming in, because when we've retired, we've accounted for the contributions stopping, but we still have that rental income coming in here. So that £300, which is why that line sort of drops back down there, because our contributions to our pensions have stopped, but we're still receiving that rental income. And you can see here that it jumps up when we start receiving the state pension, and that starts to cover greater and greater chunks of our spending, especially when we reach this 85 years old here, when I've assumed that spending steps down 25%. So that's all our data inputted. Now we can just start to see what the results for that are. So if I hop across to the dashboard tab at the bottom here, so we can see that my retirement age is 60 because I'd put in 25, because I'd put in 25 as the retirement age, that it's 35 years to retire, and that the rental income and investments bring in £300 per month. Now, again, it's just brought over our spending chart here so we can see it. And what we're presented with here is the results from our 3 selected investment portfolio options. And you can also put in your success rate that you're targeting. So I've put in a 90% success rate. So anything that's less than a 90% success rate on our simulated portfolios is going to flag up. And so you'll see here that the 60/40 global fund is actually only passing about 84.5% of the times. There are some failure instances, and you can see that down in the chart down here, where some failures in our 10th percentile are starting to drop below the 0 line, which suggests that we've run out of money in those scenarios. Now, I will just say that the way the returns are generated, because they're generated using a Monte Carlo simulation, it's potentially not the most accurate way of simulating the real world. It is commonly used in financial modelling, but it's just something to be aware of and is worth doing a little bit of reading about. I'd also see these charts down here, they don't reflect individual portfolio returns. So this is at any given discrete month. This represents the 10th, 25th, median, 75th and 90th percentile portfolio value. And that's why the chart looks very up and straight lines with very few sort of big drawdowns. Actually, you can see quite clearly here in the 60/40 portfolio, you can see a big jump here, and this must be when we get the house downsizing money come in. And you can see actually that those top portfolios, that's actually really beneficial because it's starting to trend down, but it completely reverses that trend, where we then reach a point where the investment returns are generally outpacing the spending that we're having. Now, just hopping back to how these percentiles work. So let's say you had the 200 simulations that were running, and let's say our 90th percentile simulation was at a certain value, and the simulation just below our 90th percentile was significantly lower. That's what accounts for these drops here. So potentially, as one portfolio overtakes another, when we move on a month, it doesn't just follow the portfolio that ends up into our 90th percentile, it checks all portfolios at that time to plot these charts. I really hope I've explained that clearly, but just be aware that that's why you'll see some like extreme numbers here, because it's plotting some of the really extreme outliers as well on both ends of the spectrum. And so it's worth just sort of trying to pick a number that you might feel comfortable with. So again, when we looked at the life expectancy for me, 99 years old, I've got sort of a 1 in 10 chance. You know, it's not particularly high chance that I'll live to 99. So I might be looking at 95, a 90% success rate might actually be significantly higher than I'm willing to risk. And I might actually be happy if something past 75% of the portfolio checks. Now, I would just say, don't play around with this number to try and get portfolios where you're hitting like 99, 100% success rates, because the way the Monte Carlo simulations work is that 200 is probably enough to give you some really bad portfolio returns that potentially, without, you know, some kind of global catastrophe happening, aren't really likely to happen in the real world. This also just pulls out some of the numbers from those portfolios, so we can see that median, based on the inputs we had, the median portfolio, if you were just plugging into a global index fund, you'd have about £360,000 in your portfolio, with, you know, some of the extreme outliers hitting, you know, the multiple millions, especially for the more equities heavy portfolios. So that's just worth looking at. And you can see the average as given by the mean is significantly higher than the median as well, which is also just worth bearing in mind. So again, I'll leave a link to this spreadsheet in the resources section. I will probably add a small cost for this spreadsheet because it's the spreadsheet that I use. I've just tidied it up so that you can use it as well. But it is a lot more detailed than the simplified spreadsheet that you can offer as well. And this potentially could save you a lot of headaches later down the line. Obviously, all the data in here can't be relied on 100% because it's a Monte Carlo simulation. So you do need to make sure that you're happy doing your own research to make sure you're happy with the trade-offs that come with this kind of financial planning, and that you maybe just do a bit more research about the drawbacks and the benefits of it. So let's just hop straight back into the presentation and wrap up. So that summarizes our crash course on how I'm approaching my retirement planning. Now, obviously, it's a massive, massive topic, and there's so much more content that we could go into here that I haven't dived into in this video because you probably would have tuned out a long, long time ago. And I would love to do some deeper dives into specific topics and sections if you're interested. But I would like to know which sections you want me to look at first, or which sections you're most interested in. It could be more about the actual saving and investing side of things. It could be more about the investment selection type of things. It might be more about, because I've generally focused more on annuities here, and then that second spreadsheet looks at more of a withdrawal rate. Maybe there's alternative withdrawals you want me to look at. So for example, there are more sort of variable withdrawal rates that we can look into if you want a more flexible drawdown schedule. And those are sort of fairly big topics in of themselves. But in the meantime, you can find everything I've spoken about in the links below, or also on my website, which I'm starting to build out, which is riskoninvestor.com. There's a resources page on that. There's also a newsletter that you can sign up to, which isn't focused just on pensions and retirements. It's more just investing generally focused. So it documents some of my journey, and I try to put out some useful and interesting things that I've discovered or read about recently, or just topics that I think is worth knowing about. You can read those. You don't have to subscribe to the newsletter to read those. But if you do subscribe, then you pick them up every week. But hopefully you found this video really helpful. If you did, really appreciate it if you'd hit the like button on the video or subscribe to the channel for more finance related content coming. By doing those and engaging with the video, it just helps it push it out to more people, and hopefully then it will be helpful to way more people, and it will help more people get themselves into a comfortable position where they're happy with their retirement plan, and then hopefully when they reach retirement, they're happy with the outcomes that they've planned towards for their life. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you soon.